Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Veguilla-Lezan for those of you who are new here. I'm a freelance graphic designer, an illustrator, and educator based out of the Midwest, and I run Bella and Sophia Creative Studio. On this channel, you are likely to find a ton of great tutorials as well as studio vlogs here and there. And this week I'm coming back to you with a new tutorial that's focused on Procreate, and we are going to be talking about texture. I love how texture can just add a really interesting and unique element to your digital artwork. And I like how it can kind of help bring some life to digital artwork, which can sometimes feel flat. And I think some people have that style where, the idea of a flat, flat colors, flat outlines, really clean outlines, it works really nicely, especially when you're looking for like a more vector style work. But today we're going to be talking about texture and adding grit and interesting kind of grunge effects to your overall artwork. So let's get started. Alright, so to get started, what we need to do is launch Procreate from our dock system. So I am going to be working on some pre-made shapes that I've created. We're going to be creating 4 different types of textures on these peach shapes. So this is what the final product will look like. So these are the 4 types of textures we're going to be working with. We're going to do a paper texture with an overlay and then adding some shadows. And then we're going to play around with some of the grungier brushes that are out there to create kind of like this grunge effect on the drawing. And then we are going to work with grain as well. And then the final option will be a halftone. So we're going to go back out into our gallery. You will likely need to set up a new artboard. You can go to the upper right hand corner, hit that plus sign, and then select the little new canvas icon here. And we're going to be working with inches. So you're going to go down to your measurement area, change it from whatever it is to inches, and then your width should be 17 inches and your height should be 11 inches. And then you want to just keep your DPI at 300. This does limit the number of layers that you're going to be using. So we are going to, if you create lots of layers, you're going to have to condense them down and clean them up as you go. But I found that I was able to finalize this with the 35 layers as needed and then hit create. So I already have some images created just for the sake of speed when it comes to working on this project together. I created a simple peach shape. All I really did was utilize the paintbrush and the fill tool, and they're each on their own layer because we're going to be grouping some of these textures and overlays and whatnot into each of these layers. So what we'll do first is rename each of the layers. So this first one, which is all the way to the left, is going to be our paper option. So I'm going to select the layer. You know it's select because it's highlighted in blue. And then I'm going to click on the little thumbnail image and I'm going to select rename. And I'm just going to change this to paper because this is going to be the paper one. Then I'm going to go to the next peach and I'm going to rename this again. Click on it, click on the thumbnail, select rename, and I'm going to change this to grunge so that we know the type of texture we're adding. The next one we're going to rename to be grit and grain, and the last one we'll rename halftones. All right, so this first one is actually the easiest to do because we're really just adding an overlay, but what you do need to do is find a texture. You could either scan in a piece of paper that you have that has lots of really nice texture. You can crumple up a piece of plain printer paper and then scan that in to kind of give like a crumple effect like what we're going to get today. Or you can just look online, simple as can be. Just make sure you're looking for websites that have some royalty-free type imagery. So Unsplash is a great one, and so is Pexels.com. Unsplash has some really great free high-resolution photos, so you could just look up paper texture and then see what comes up. And already you see a whole bunch of really great options. And what we can do is just find one that we like, and then once you click on it, you'll see a little, like a downward facing arrow. You can click on that and it'll download to your iPad. And then once you've found a texture that you like, we can just place it into Procreate. So to place this image, what we'll do is we're going to go up to our wrench icon and we're going to select add, and then we're going to insert a file. We have to do it this way. You could, if you like if you took a photo with your iPad, you can insert a photo. But because we downloaded that file from Unsplash directly from the internet, it's going to save it into our downloads in our file system. So we'll want to select insert a file. And then it'll take us to whatever's on our iPad. I would suggest going to downloads. And then you should find them somewhere in your system. You should be able to find them in your downloads on your system. And then here they are for me here. So I'm going to select that. And then it's going to place it onto my workspace here. I'm going to resize it just a bit. And I know it doesn't look like anything yet, but what's nice is that we've inserted this on its own layer. So what we can do is create a clipping mask. We want to make sure that the layer is on top of the actual element that we're going to be editing and clipping it down to. So we wouldn't want the layer to be down here under halftones because that's not the peach we're working on. We want to have it right above our paper peach. So what we're going to do is we're going to select that layer and then click on the little thumbnail, and then we're going to go down to clipping mask, and immediately you'll see it'll clip down into that shape. And of course we don't want it to just cover the shape completely. We want it to kind of like show the color, and we kind of want to have it act as an overlay. So what we can do is play around with the different effects that we have. You could also play around with the opacity. For now, let's keep it at 100%. And then we're going to play around with the different options, the layer options. You'll see if we work with any of these options other than normal, it's going to have an effect on how this is added into the layers here. So what I find with something like this, luminosity works really nice, but so does multiply. I think multiply is the best option usually for something like this. Or overlay. Overlay tends to brighten things, whereas multiply tends to darken them. So what we're going to do is select multiply, and then we're going to adjust the opacity so it's not so dark. And then right away, we'll see already it's added this really nice paper texture that impacts the color, and that kind of creates this really nice effect of kind of like a paper cutout. But obviously we're going to do a little bit more work to this. But what I want to do first before we start that is group these two elements together. So I'm going to make sure I have the inserted image selected, and then I'm going to swipe right on the paper peach layer, and then I'm going to select group so that everything that we're working on stays within this group. So I'm going to make sure with that group selected, I'm going to hit plus. And if it doesn't go into the group, I'm just going to take that layer and drag it underneath that new group. And I'm going to make sure that that layer is right underneath the inserted image so that we can start to add some additional elements like additional texture, shadows, and highlights. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the brushes that I like to use in this kind of case. So we used cookies and just a regular studio brush that you can find, like the studio brush you can find in your Procreate set, and that already gave me some texture, but we have some other really fun textures as well. 6B pencil is a great one, and so is chai, and that's what we're going to start with first. We want to add some shadow and highlight to create more of a 3D effect, and then this is another place where you can really up the overall stylistic approach when it comes to using texture. What you want to do is select the brush, and what we're going to do is just add some texture. So based on that original peachy pinky orange kind of color, I'm just going to drag this down and darken it just a bit so that I have kind of like a darker effect with the color to help me build up some of these shadows. And like I said, a great way to add some of this texture is by including brushes that have texture when it comes to laying down your shadows and your highlights. So I'm going to increase this just a bit, and just like what we did with the paper, we've made sure that by dragging that new layer in between the paper and the peach, we've once again created a clipping mask. So if you don't see that downward arrow, just make sure you click on the thumbnail, select clipping mask, and the whole purpose of this is so that when you lay down color, it's not going to go outside of the shape we've already created. So I'm just kind of keeping in mind where light might be hitting, and I kind of want the light to come from the upper left hand side, so that would leave a shadow on the right side here. And again, you could already see some of this texture being added because of the overall shape of this actual brush. So I'm going to add another layer on top of that, and I'm going to go and select a lighter version of that pink, and just again kind of think about where the light might be hitting and what I can do to kind of give shape to this. And then I'm going to go back into my brushes, and I think I'm going to select like this dry brush, which is another really good brush to kind of add some interesting effects on top of this shape. And I think I'm going to go with kind of a color in between the lightest and the darkest here. And then I'm just going to increase the size of this just a bit. And then I'm just going to go a little bit darker once more. I'm going to create another layer, just making sure everything is above this shape but below the paper. And I'm going to select the Bonobus chalk brush, which is actually a brush that is a part of the Procreate set. Just a bit more of a deeper, darker shadow on these edges. And already, as you see, as we lay this down, it kind of gives it more of like a grain texture. And then I'm going to go into my leaves here and pick up the color by holding my finger or my pen onto the green. And then I'm just going to create another layer above this, and that will be the layer that I'm going to use to paint some of the shadow effects on this leaf as well. And already it gives us this really nice kind of 3D shape, 3D effect to this without doing too much. You could refine this down even more, but again, it's just utilizing the texture overlay does a really good job of adding some interest into an otherwise flat shape. Alright, so that is our paper option. So with everything grouped, let's rename this group. Let's click on the thumbnail, select rename, and then we'll just change it to paper so we know this is our paper group. Alright, so now let's move on to our grunge effect. So there's tons and tons of different brushes that you can utilize to create kind of like a grungier, kind of beat up look to your artwork. I have a bunch of brushes that I've bought or I've downloaded, but Procreate comes with quite a few that are really, really helpful. If you go into your brush library, scroll down to spray paints, you can utilize the splatter brushes and the flicks for some really great grunge effects. There's also the organic brushes here, which are really great with texture. So like things like twig and sable and bamboo, they do a good job of adding kind of like a distressed look to your artwork. So those are some good ones. And then of course I've imported a bunch from packs that I've bought, but some of my favorites are from the True Grit brand. They have beautiful stamp brushes that give i.e. like they're called True Grit because they sell these really great gritty brushes. So True Grit is a great one, and then there's a really good grunge pack. And then another one that I like a lot that I got from Creative Market is the Idle Letters Deadhead set. And there's just some really great coverage brushes, things like scrub, speckle, scratch. They just have a really great set of grunge brushes that I like to use, and some really awesome halftones. So we're going to be working with a few of those. And then, like I said, some of the texture brushes directly from Procreate that you can get from like the sketching, the inking, as well as the painting and the artistic brush libraries, which is where I pulled quite a few of these. So when it comes to this kind of like grunge effect, what we're going to do first is go back to that Bonobos brush that we're using that kind of gives it a bit of a grainy effect. So we'll create a new layer, and then what I want to do is select that new layer and then select my peach layer, and then I'm going to group them. And then just right away, let's rename it so that we know what we're working with. So grunge. And then what we're going to do is go into those layers, and we're going to select that new layer that we added, click on the thumbnail, and we're going to do a clipping mask. So just like what we did before, we're clipping whatever we're doing into the shape that we've already previously created, just so that everything stays within the element that we're working on. I'm going to go first to that Bonobos chalk. I'm going to pick up the orange from that peach, and then I'm just going to drag the color down a bit so that I can darken it up. And then I'm going to increase the size of the brush, and then I'm just going to start kind of like, again, keeping in mind that my light source is coming from the upper left hand side. I'm just going to start kind of creating where the shadow would be on the right hand side and kind of towards the bottom. And already we see a bit of that grain effect here. And then I'm going to go in and just darken that a bit more. And then I'm going to decrease the size of that and just kind of focus on my edges here. And then I'm going to kind of follow the curve of where the indent of the peach would be, just to give it some shape. Once I've done that, then what I like to do is kind of utilize the eraser to kind of take away some of the color. What you could do is duplicate that original peach shape just so that you have an extra just in case something, goes wrong. So you have two in here. What we'll do is uncheck mark one, and we'll just work on the copy. So we're going to select our erase tool, and then what we're going to do is go into our texture brushes that will create kind of like this distressed effect, pulling out some of the color and things like that. So I'm going to go into that idle letters set that I have, and I'm going to go and select some of this kind of speckle, scratch, scuff brushes that they have here. And I'm just going to increase the size a bit. And I'm just going to kind of like go into specific areas. And you can see already that it's kind of like erasing and pulling color up. So then I'm going to go back into that. And then I'm going to select some of this. I'm going to select scuff here as well. I'm going to decrease the size of this just a bit. And I'm going to use that almost to kind of create like a highlight. And again, this just gives it an interesting kind of like vintage looking effect on the overall color here. Almost like the color's been rubbed off. So just go into key areas to kind of just like pull some of the color off. It doesn't have to be perfect. You want it to feel like it's been rubbed off over time, essentially. And then I'm going to go back in there, and I'm going to select this scrape one and just kind of go into key areas and add some of that just to kind of create that faded effect. Once I've done that, then I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to make sure that that layer is below my shadow layer. And I'm just going to add in some additional colors to kind of give some more visual interest into the overall color and shape of the peach. So I'm going to pick up that orange again, and then I'm going to kind of pull it to the right to add a little bit more red. And then I'm going to go in and utilize the nickel roll brush here, which is another really great brush with texture that's found right in the Procreate app itself. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to buy it. It's already included. And then I'm just going to add some color down. And then you can decrease the size as well. And then I'm going to darken this up a bit again and just kind of like blend some of the colors here, just to give it some visual interest. Once I've laid this color down, I can go in and use my blender tool here. And you can blend with the different brushes. I'm just going to do a soft blend using my airbrush tools here. And then you can kind of like blend the colors so there's not a huge distinction between the darker and lighter areas, and you can create more of a fluid gradient. And what's nice too with these is that we can play around with the blend modes as well here in your layer options. We can select where that N is, and then you'll see your different layer options come up, and you can adjust them. You can do multiply, you can darken, Normal is what we have. You can lighten. Each of these will give a different effect. So in this case, I'm just going to keep it as normal. I'm going to go into my shadow layer, and then I'm going to look at the options here. And I think I like multiply for this because it darkens it up a bit, but then you can adjust your opacity and decrease how dark that is. So I'm just going to bring it down to about 70%. I think I like that. And now that we have shadows here, we want to add some highlights. And then I think we can move on to our next option. So let's hit the plus icon in our layers. This is going to be our highlight. So what we'll want to do is just click on it, and then we'll want to clip it down. And then we want to make sure that we're clipping it down into the peach itself and not any of the other layers. And then what we're going to do is select a brighter, lighter version of this peach so that we can start adding some highlights in. And what I think we're going to use for this is the pudding brush here. And I got this brush from the Sweet Treats set as well. And what we'll do is just kind of like think about where the highlights might be for this shape. So since the lighting is coming from the upper left hand side, that's probably where the brightest marks are going to be. So I'm just using this sweet brush again just to add some lighter effects, and again just include texture because this has a really great texture effect to it. Then I'm going to go to a bright white, and then I'm going to select my dry brush. And I'm just going to add some scratches here and there just to give it some interest. And then you might want to adjust your size so you can see more of it. And then I think I'm going to go back into my like the grunge layer where I was using the eraser. And I'm going to select that scrape tool again. And I'm going to use it on top of everything here once more. Just kind of like going around the edges. And then I'll use my Bonnebush chalk to give like the biggest highlight. Because I think it does a good job of creating a soft highlight without it feeling too harsh. Alright, and that is our kind of like grunge effect. I like just the idea of erasing, making things look and feel like they're distressed when adding this kind of texture to artwork. It's kind of meant to just, I feel like it creates like a vintage vibe when you're working with this kind of distressing. Okay, now that we're done with that, let's move on to our next one. So this one, what we're going to do is we'll close that grunge group, and then we're going to move on to the grit and grain. So it's kind of like a combination of adding a grain effect over this, but then pulling in some of those ideas and those brushes from the grunge kind of style for this particular one. So what we'll do first is we're going to create a copy of this original grit and grain layer. So let's swipe left and select duplicate. And then we're going to create a layer above it as well. And then I want us to group all of those layers together. So we're going to rename it. And we're going to change this one to Grit and Grain. And then we're going to open up that group, and we're going to turn off the original because we're not going to be working on that one. And we're going to select the copy that we've made. And what we're going to do is we're going to utilize some of the adjustment functions that we have here in Procreate. In the upper left hand corner, right next to the wrench icon, you'll see something that looks like essentially like a magic wand. What we want to do is select noise, and we're going to select layer. And basically this will apply this noise filter across anything that is on this layer. And what I like about this noise filter is that it does a good job of just adding some kind of like graininess to your original layer. That's why I tell you though to make a copy of this, because it does adjust the entire layer. And then what we want to do is slide our pencil across the image to the right or to the left to add more. So you kind of see it, if we go too far right, it's going to give us a bunch of noise. And when I think of noise, it's almost like if you remember back in the day with televisions, if it was on a channel that you didn't have access to, it created all that fuzzy white noise on your screen. That's essentially what this is doing. It's adding some of that kind of effect to your imagery. So once you drag it across your screen to the percentage that you like, I think I'm just going to keep that about a 5%. You can adjust the scale of the noise in these options at the bottom. You can adjust the octave, so basically how deep the contrast is. I think I'm going to increase this just a bit. And you can adjust your turbulence as well. I think this is good. And then if we zoom out, it just kind of blurs it up a little bit. It gives it some visual interest. It's not just this flat color. And then what we'll do, once we've done this kind of pass over, then we can start adding some additional touches to this. So again, obviously we're going to add some highlights and some shadows, but we can utilize some different types of overlays as well. So we added this bit of grain, right? And I think this is a good job of giving it some visual interest, but I want to give it some more heavy texture. So what we're going to do in this layer that we created, this additional layer, is we're going to create an overlay that we are going to then clip into this shape that we've created. So what I like to do is create kind of like this canvasy background. So similar to what we did with this paper one, I'm going to create an overlay using some of the texture brushes that we have here in Procreate, and then we're going to clip it in and play with the overall layer effects and layer options to kind of make it feel as if this is on, say, something like canvas. So what we're going to do is utilize a brush first to create kind of a nice overlay, and then we'll do the next step. So first things we want to go to is under charcoals, which is an option that you have here in Procreate, and you select carbon stick. That's what we'll be working with. I just have it in my texture brushes for this project. We're going to use this to create kind of like a texture. So on this layer, we're going to go into our colors, and we want to use our dual color options here. You want to make sure that we set our colors. The first one should be black. So we'll click on it, and then the first one should be black, and then the second one will be white, and we're using our dual colors here. And then making sure carbon stick is selected. Adjust the size of this. And we're just going to paint over the entire peach here. And then what we're going to do is go into that layer, we're going to select it, and we're going to create a clipping mask like we did before. And then we're going to go into our layer options here. We're going to click where it says N, and we're going to select overlay. And once we've done that, we're also going to bring the opacity down just a bit to about 40%. And already you can see it adds this additional texture to it that almost feels like you're painting on, say, something like a canvas. Again, we've added some texture. Now we want to bring it to life and give it some shape. So what we'll do now is we will hit our plus, and we're going to drag this in between our overlay and in between the original grit and grain shape. And we're going to start to add some shadows and some highlights. So for this first one, we'll work with a shadow, and we're going to switch our layer option from normal to multiply. And then we are going to go back to our color picker, find that original peachy color, and then we're just going to bring it down a bit to darken it up. And we are going to work with another charcoal brush. This one is called Vine Charcoal. You'll find it in your charcoal brush set. So we're going to select Vine Charcoal, and I'm just going to increase the size of this. And then just like what I did before, I'm just going to keep in mind my light source is coming from the upper left, and then I'm just going to start painting where I think the shadows will be. And then I'm going to go in again and bring it down a little bit deeper in terms of the color. And I'm going to select that Bonobos chalk. And then I'm going to add the deepest color right at the edges. And then I'm going to pick up that peach again, and then I'm going to go in and select the dry brush, and I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to add that to the top of above the charcoal overlay, just so that it gives it a little bit more color and doesn't feel so washed out. I'm going to go back into my shadow and then go back into that vine charcoal brush and just kind of add some additional darker spots onto the shape. And then I'm going to go into my layers, add another layer, and then what we'll do is create a highlight here, and I'm going to drag this towards the bottom and make sure it's clipped into my original shape. I'm going to select a very, very light peach color, and then we're going to work on creating some of these highlights, and I'm going to use that chai brush again and kind of use it to like add some highlights at the very top of the peach, and then I can adjust the size to just kind of give me more precision for where I'm placing these colors. And then I'm going to pick up some of this green and I'm going to lighten it up a bit, and then again giving some of the leaf area some highlights as well, adjusting the size of my brush. And then I can do the same thing in the shadows layer. You can create a new layer for the green, or you can just keep it on the same layer. I'm just going to keep it on the same layer, and then I'm going to decrease it going back to that shadow layer. And then I'm just going to add some dark areas. And then what we can do here is go in and again just add some of that grit using those grit brushes. I'm going to go into my True Grit stamp brushes and I'm going to just select stamp 6. And then instead of doing a white, I think I'm going to do kind of like a gray to add some distress to this. So it doesn't always, just kind of highlight, it doesn't always have to be a white color that you're using to distress your imagery. You could use black, you could use gray. So I'm going to create a new layer on top of all of this, and then I'm going to add, and then I'm going to drag that layer underneath my overlay, and you could add some of that distress so it kind of dirties it, muddies it up a little bit. And then you can just mix two. You don't have to use one color. I'm going to use a bit of that gray, and then I'm going to do some of the white, and it just gives it this kind of like gritty effect. You don't have to do all of it, you know, or as much as I'm doing here. As you can see in the original, this is a really nice textured setup as it is, and it feels very close to realism, as real as my style gets. But you can add some additional grunge effects if you'd like as well, just for some visual interest. So you can make it really large, you can decrease the size, make it smaller, or just keep in mind where you'd like to see that grit applied, and just play with it that way. I think this is a good final place for this. You added a little bit of grit, but then we got that texture from the overlay. And that's a really easy way if you don't want to go and find paper or scan paper in. You can use any of these texture brushes that we have here in Procreate. There's a ton under painting, a bunch under artistic, and then I like using these charcoal brushes when I want to create kind of like a canvas effect. So these are good options to use as well. All right, so that is our third peach. Now let's start on our final, which I think is probably the most fun of them all. I like all of these different styles, but for using halftones just reminds me of like retro and vintage comic books and just overall creative artistic styles. And I like to pull that in from time to time. So what we're going to do now is close up this layer group for our grit and grain, move over to our next peach. And this is going to be our halftones. So we're going to create a new layer above it. And then we're going to select them. And we are going to group them. And then we'll go into that group. We're going to rename it. And we're going to change it to say halftones. And then hit return. Open that group back up. And then go into your new layer. So with halftones, there's different ways you can go about adding a halftone. In your adjustments, there is the halftone option. I don't like how it does it personally, but you can play with it. You can just select halftone, do layer, and then just like what we did before, you can adjust. So we can select the layer with the image on it. I would duplicate it just in case. So we have another one that we're working with, but we'll select that duplicated layer, go into our adjustments, and then go down to halftone, and then you can select layer. Just like before, we slide to create the halftone. I feel like it gives it kind of, I mean, it's fun, but it's more or less very like one-dimensional. So, and I don't want this to be one-dimensional. So what I think will be our best bet is to utilize some halftone brushes. If we look at the final piece that I made in my original set here, I use the halftone for dark areas, light areas, but then of course I pull in some shadows with other texture brushes as well. And I feel like doing it this way gives us more control over the placement of the halftone. So what I like to do first is actually put down my shadows and then go in and add the halftones and then figure out where my highlights are going to be. So with this new duplicated, so we've duplicated this shape, what we want to do is go into this new layer, and then I'm going to pick up the orange by holding my finger down on the color in my image or holding my pencil down. And then what we'll do is, of course, darken it just a bit. I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to grab the fuzzy marker brush, which I don't remember if it comes from a different, like if I downloaded it or got it from something like Creative Market. And making sure this layer is clipped down into my peach, I'm going to select that layer, select clipping mask, and then I'm going to increase the size of this marker just a bit, and I'm going to start to create my shadows. This is a really nice kind of like smooth brush. I like it a lot for stuff like this. And we could always blend out, of course, as we're working, because this does have more of an edge to it. We need to blend it a bit more than some of these other textured brushes that we were working with today. So once I've laid that first run down, I'm going to use my blender tool with a soft blend turned on. I'm just going to kind of blend it so that it gradiates nicely into the original color. And then I'm going to go back into my layers here, add another layer, and drag it in between that shadow layer and the original drawing. And then I'm going to deepen this color just a bit. And I'm going to go back to that Bonobos chalk. And I'm going to do a pass of that right over my edges here. And then I'm going to go back and create a new layer on top of that, still keeping with that Bonobos. I'm going to lighten the overall peach color. I'm going to increase the size of this. And then I'm just going to start adding some additional color. And I'm lightening it up a bit, but making it a bit more red, just to give it some visual interest. And there's no rhyme or reason other than I'm keeping in mind what a peach looks like in my head, and thinking about all the different colors that are usually, you see in this, just to make it a little bit more realistic for kind of like the underlay before we add the kind of, comic book vibe feeling halftones on top. So staying on that same layer, I'm going to then go into my brushes and I'm going to select this Brush Up oil brush, because it's another really great kind of like textured brush. If it's supposed to feel like oil painting, and just kind of give some of these areas some strokes of color, some interest. And then I'm going to blend this in a bit just so that it's not so overwhelming once I add the halftone on top of it. So now I'm going to create one more layer and I'm going to add some highlights. I'm going to add an additional layer, just making sure it's still clipped. And then I'm going to select a very light peach color. And then I'm going to go into my brush options here. I'm going to select that vine charcoal again. And I'm going to start adding some highlights here. I'm just going to add this right to the edge because we're going to start adding the halftones here, and I don't want it to be overpowered by anything that's underneath them. So now we'll add our first halftone layer. So we're going to add a new layer. Make sure it's clipped down into our shape. And then I'm going to select just a pure white. And then I'm going to go into my brushes. If you go into the Procreate brush library, if you select vintage, there's some options for halftones that you can utilize that work really nicely. This is the newsprint. And you can resize it, adjust your opacity. And it works really nicely for what Procreate has. There's also the galaxies and the campana. Again, some additional just nice textures in terms of creating a halftone. But I want more of a traditional looking halftone, so I'm going to go into a brush set that I purchased. There are some really good halftones with the Idol Letter set, but I have another set of halftones that I imported through, I think, Gumroad. This is a good set. If I can find it, I'll make sure to link it into the description box, and I'll make sure to link the brushes that I have in my sets in the description box as well. I'm going to go with halftone 1, and then I'm going to select a dark color, like a dark gray, and I'm going to use that on the side where I have my shadows here. Just for a fun creative effect, I'm going to adjust if I got any on the leaves. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to change my color from that dark grayish black to a white. And then I'm going to create a new layer on top of everything else, making sure it's still clipped in. And I'm going to use that on the other side to add some brightness and highlights. Then I'm just going to keep layering on the white in terms of where that highlight is supposed to be for me. And then we can go in and still add some additional creative elements on top of this with some more of these textured brushes. So I'm going to go back in. I've done the halftone. I'm going to go back in, I think, with my fuzzy marker and just kind of over exaggerate where that highlight might be, and then go back into my under layers here with like the shadow effects and stuff like that, and use my Nico roll and just kind of add some additional color here just so that it gives it some variety, just to add some visual interest with additional colors. Once I add in the halftone, I just kind of go in one more time with the shadows and just deepen and darken key areas. And that is the final effect. I like this one. I think it's fun. It gives it a bit of a retro vibe. And I think these are all just really great ways to kind of pull in visual interest with texture and just add something interesting and unique to your overall final artwork. I hope you all enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful. And if you like videos like this, if you like tutorials like this, make sure you subscribe to my channel. And if you like this tutorial in general, feel free to leave it a like. And if you use any of these techniques, let me know in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for your support. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.